how much money is that? With a number this large, it helps to compare it to the overall size of America's economy, what economists call the gross domestic product, or GDP. In February 2007, when our federal debt was $8.7 trillion, our GDP was around $13.5 trillion. That meant that our federal debt was about 64% of our GDP. This level of debt to GDP is not the real problem. It's where we're headed that matters, and it's projected to get much worse in the future. In addition, as you'll find out soon, this $8.7 trillion number is only a fraction of our nation's total fiscal challenge. Today's federal debt is the sum of all of our annual budget deficits and surpluses going back to the beginning of our federal government. Our war for independence created much of our early debt, and by March 4th, 1789, the first day of our federal government, our national debt was $75 million, which was about 40% of our economy. This terrified our founding fathers, and they acted quickly to pay it down. We didn't stay there for long. The Civil War not only had a huge human cost, it brought the United States to the brink of bankruptcy. However, like before, we paid our debt down quickly. In 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created to help manage the nation's money supply and to oversee national banks. That year was also the birth of the modern income tax. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Several years later, the Great Depression brought with it extreme economic hardship for millions of Americans.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens.
It is insurance that you and your employer have bought and paid for.
World War II was a time of sacrifice, and while the government took on unprecedented levels of debt, Americans bought savings bonds to finance our winning the war.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Humphrey Bogart.
Our fighting men have just won history's greatest victory for freedom. Buy bonds for their future and for your own future.
We've got another bond to buy.
It's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
The large military and social spending practices of the 1960s and 70s were two key factors that led to a major economic downturn by the end of the 1970s. The 1980s saw the rise of supply-side economics.
It's morning again in America.
Reaganomics.
You're the trickle-down theory guy.
I'm betting my reputation on it.
The controversial Laffer curve proposed that lower marginal tax rates would eventually generate higher tax revenues. The theory did have its critics.
Let me just give you a difference that I have with Governor Reagan on taxes. It is what I call a voodoo economic policy.
For decades, we have piled deficit upon deficit, mortgaging our future and our children's future for the temporary convenience of the present.
Read my lips.
The debate over supply-side economics continues to this day, but what is not debatable is that the federal debt exploded in the 1980s. A fundamental shift had occurred. America was becoming addicted to debt. Never before in our history had so much debt been created during an era of relative peace and prosperity. Yes, the Cold War ended, but it came at an extremely high price. In the last 40 years, we've had 35 budget deficits and only 5 budget surpluses. But remember, we've been running large annual surpluses in our Social Security program for years. These surpluses are spent every year to help pay other bills in the federal government. Without the Social Security surpluses, our real track record on deficits looks a whole lot worse. In less than 10 years, Social Security will be paying out more than it takes in, and will only get worse as baby boomers retire in larger and larger numbers. By 2017, Social Security will not be helping to reduce our overall deficit, it will be adding to it. Our enormous Medicare deficits and other federal spending that also lie ahead will only make this situation worse.
But what is really worrisome is the longer-run future. If you look at just 3 programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, the spending for those programs under current rules will rise very rapidly over the next few years.
Made fiscal responsibility a key issue during the presidential campaign. The country woke up, recognized the challenge, and demanded change.
Politics of sound fiscal policy are very difficult because the natural inertia in the political system, if you will, is toward federal programs.
The concepts of sacrificing and building for a better tomorrow have been pushed aside by our live for today, easy credit, and consumption-oriented society. Many Americans have never seen a rainy day and therefore simply choose not to save for one. This is a major problem because savings results in increased investment, additional research and development, a stronger economy, and an improvement in our overall standard of living. Is America's low savings rate today strictly a matter of personal choice, or are there also other forces at play here?
Dr. Paul.
Good morning, Mr. Greenspan. I understand that you did not take my friendly advice last fall. I thought maybe you should look for other employment, but I see you kept your job. I'm pleased that you're back, though, because at least you remember the days of sound money.
In the early 70s, due to the breakdown of the monetary system, it excited me enough to want to speak out.
The concern a sound money economist has is for the supply of money. If you increase the supply of money, you have inflation. I know Wall Street likes it, and the economy likes it when the bubble's getting bigger, but I think it's harmful.
Inflation is very simple. When government arbitrarily, out of thin air, prints money, creates money and credit out of thin air. And when I talk to many teenagers, grade schoolers, they seem to have no problem comprehending the fact that if you just create a lot of money, it'll be like monopoly money and it won't have value.
Dr. Paul, you're raising an issue which a significant number of people have been raising over the years, and for which, frankly, we're not quite sure what the answers are.
Alan Greenspan was the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. I see the central bank, the Federal Reserve System, as having this tremendous power over money and credit. Greenspan, or any chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, is more powerful than even our president because he has so much control over the economy. Many countries have bitten the dust through the inflation, even in ancient times. This is a very serious problem, and the biggest fear will be that if the Fed creates too much money, we're going to have a crash of the dollar.
And for 3 years, you've never been once in the target range. You know, if I set my targets and I perform like that as a physician, my patient would die.
By the dawn's early light, once so proudly we at the twilight's last gleaming, whose buds rise